So our podcast recording software scraped automatically through every single recording and picked out the word we use most often.
FIFA. Well, clearly I never use the word FIFA. I must just say Gianni or other things, Infantino. Or maybe I say it in a different accent, like FIFA.
You've got no agenda.
No, exactly.
Well, I think the accent from Yorkshire is a bit tricky at the best of times, Ziggs. I think it's definitely that.
Well, see how many times you mention it in this episode as we take a look back on some of our reporting highlights and trips and news stories of 2025. Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked, and thanks for listening throughout the year to Tariq Panja from the New York Times, Martyn Ziegler from the Times, and myself, Rob Harris from Sky News. So we're going to reflect on some of the places we've been, some of the moments we've had. One place none of us were at was the Club World Cup in the United States.
No, we weren't there. And it was a sort of fairly newsy tournament. So in a way, it was a pity that none of us were there. Nevertheless, we travelled the length and breadth of the world chasing sports news stories.
And we spent a lot of time talking about the Club World Cup, the fallout from it, and some of the relations there, particularly between Donald Trump and Gianni Infantino, which was a relationship that really defined the year and defined some of the trips, not just for us.
Certainly defined the trips for Gianni Infantino, didn't it?
The president of FIFA, Gianni Infantino. FIFA. Where's Johnny? Whoa, Johnny, my boy. I didn't know he was going to be here. He's big stuff.
We've talked about his various trips as part of Donald Trump's entourage to events that left some of us wondering, what has any of this got to do with football? Trips to the Middle East, trips to the Red Sea coast. But he was late for one of his own trips.
Yeah, so this was one of actually my, I think, most interesting story, trip, assignment that I covered, which was going to Paraguay for the FIFA Congress, the annual Congress. And it sort of set the scene for the whole year, because normally you'd expect the FIFA president to come along, and about 3 days beforehand, there's always various things happening, a council meeting usually, then there's sort of meeting of the confederations, plus stuff with the hosts. But because he had been invited on a Donald Trump business summit to the Middle East, to the Gulf, Infantino didn't do any of that. He didn't do any of the build-up. And in fact, his late arrival delayed the start of the Congress. He actually arrived several hours late and prompted a sort of unprecedented walkout by some of the UEFA members who were furious about all this.
Yeah, we've done a few of these FIFA congresses over the years, so people new to this world, probably not a lot of our listeners, I guess, is that this is FIFA's annual meeting. So it's Gianni Infantino's annual meeting for all the members. FIFA has 211 members. It costs several $1 million to put together, and for the host country, it's a really big deal. Paraguay had put the military out on the street to protect the FIFA members. The president was in place. Kind of real weirdness was a bunch of us on a flight tracking app seeing this private jet leaving Qatar. I think that was the last stop. It was Saudi Arabia, then Qatar. Getting to, I think it was Nigeria for a refueling stop or something like this, and then watching it come over the Atlantic Ocean and eventually arriving in Paraguay several hours late. And that walkout was pretty incredible at the time. And why all of this fits together is partly because FIFA is saying it needs huge amount of money to dole out to football associations to benefit the game. It spent millions on this event, and it just seemed to be a real waste of money in a way.
But what's the consequence? We had the UEFA statement, which complained about Gianni Infantino pursuing private political interests with that walkout by UEFA. Symbolic, but nothing much else beyond that. Who's got the power as the year ends? What's the consequence been of it? Yes, there was that partial climb down on ticket prices. coming under pressure from the FAs when they all gathered in Qatar for the end of year meetings and the FIFA best. But while it's a sort of lively moment to talk about and a lot of frustration all around, no one actually used it as a platform to protest, to really raise their anger and concern about how the leadership was running things.
I think that's a great point as well. Like, the power, as we get to the end of the year, firmly is with Gianni Infantino, it seems like, at the top of FIFA. And the UEFA moment was pretty strong, but largely symbolic. And also, they walked back some of those words a week later as well, I think. But really, what it does is sully football's reputation, or how football's governed on a global level. That's what it did. It put it into the headlines. It put it onto the TV screens that these people are a little bit of an embarrassment. And that can't be a good look in itself.
No, it was also a strange Congress in that it was very, very sort of media unfriendly. It kind of looked like people who'd been organising it gone out of their way to make life difficult. So for the first time that I can remember, the sort of media weren't allowed access to the FIFA hotel, and actually I'd arranged to do an interview with a senior FIFA figure there, and turned up at the hotel, was told I couldn't do that, and it was lots of toing and froing, and it was a bit ridiculous. And then again, they weren't allowed access to the Congress Hall, which normally you can go and speak to delegates. But that didn't happen either. But we did our best. We managed to speak to people. In fact, we came out with a good story, didn't we? Because that's where we got it confirmed that they were going to use dynamic pricing for the World Cup, and that obviously has caused enormous furore over the recent weeks.
Yeah, setting the tone for the stories through the rest of the year, really. And to paint the picture, when it's the FIFA Congress, it's not like a football stadium. Unless you're a celebrity chef, you can't just go and walk on the pitch. You can, before and after the session, just wander right up to the front of the room, spot a delegation. They're all lined up in alphabetical order in a seat. So you might think, oh, I want to talk to South Africa or France or Iraq, and you can go and find them, or go right to the front of the room and you can speak to any of the leaders there. But that's what it does deny. And sometimes you get the opportunity to catch up with FAs beyond your sort of more narrow circle. So you do actually get a broader worldview by doing that, which is obviously the FIFA mantra about trying to be more global.
Yes, well, that was almost how we ended. We were Ziegs, Adam Crafton from The Athletic, and we were trapped in a lift with some of those FAs. I think Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, someone from the USA, and also Jason Roberts from CONCACAF. We went to try and catch up with them at a hotel, and the lift we were in almost took an almighty drop, and that could have been the end of Sport Unlocked as we know it.
Yeah, that was a very frightening moment. I think so traumatic. You've actually got your ex-footballers wrong, Tariq. Jason Roberts was not in the lift.
Sorry, Jason Roberts.
It was Ryan Nelson was in the lift, and the head of the New Zealand FA. But yes, we survived, sweating heavily. But I'm sure Rob was probably, half of you were thinking, perhaps you could go it alone. You were thinking this has been your big opportunity. Been denied that.
To talk for an hour. It has been known on some broadcast platforms to have to talk for a lot of time. But who would I be devil's advocate towards?
Your fallen comrades, I hope.
It's interesting, you mentioned comms and PR a lot, not calling out people by name, but more broadly on this. Towards the end of the year, it is a theme that the one football leader internationally who does give a lot of media is the CAF president, Patrice Motsepe. Gave another hour-long presser ahead of the AFCON beginning in December. It happens after their congresses. Actually, Matthias Grafton from FIFA was next to him as well, the Secretary General. So questions could have been asked there. But Motsepe does expose himself to a lot of questions, which means he's often facing those questions about, as we heard in last week's episode, about FIFA, about access to the World Cup, about visas and things like that. He becomes the face, yet you wouldn't necessarily have associated him as the most sort of media engaging person.
No, and it's interesting that he's taking the questions for FIFA, because in that role he's also a FIFA vice president, I guess. He's also one of the vice presidents who's closest to Gianni Infantino. So I suppose he probably has the the president's ear in a sense.
And a mention of Victor Montagliani, the CONCACAF president, who went as the Leaders Conference in London and other events, has been on this pod as well at length over the years too.
Very accessible, yeah.
In fact, he was a person I was interviewing at that hotel in Paraguay where I had to fight my way through security.
But one of those themes of the year, while it might be grumbling about comms and about the access in that way, the direction is set from higher up, isn't it? Or are we asking comms people to fight more for us to get us that access?
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of end result of what's been a sort of a drift, both at FIFA and UEFA, but more significantly at FIFA, when I think it's been decided that the old-fashioned press conferences aren't going to happen anymore because they lead to too many negative headlines and you ask too many difficult questions. So a good way of avoiding difficult questions is not letting yourself be asked any.
Yeah, and Instagram seems to be the year of Instagram as well, 2025, certainly when it comes to FIFA announcements through Gianni Infantino. That seems to be the way forward. I guess 2026, there's also a tendency to go towards the influencer model as well. I think we're going to see some of that as well.
That has been one of the growing trends of the year, which is the football influencers, how they use to promote the messaging, to give the messaging that governing bodies, clubs, agents want out there, overlooking some of those big talking points at times that fans might really be engaged in. And they are very much the conduits of approved information.
It is approved information, and I suppose it serves everyone's business model as well, doesn't it? It kind of gives a greater degree of legitimacy to people who have their own platforms, looking to get engagement, looking like they're with these governing bodies, and it allows the governing bodies to at least give a veneer of independence that, look, it's not us saying it, it is this third party that is saying it. What will be interesting, and I think you pointed it out, Rob, is that some of these people, when they're doing this work or some of these things, say that these are ads, some don't. So that's also that kind of interesting element of the media industry that we're living in right now.
But maybe football's biggest influencer, big figure on social media, is Donald Trump, the person who, when he's often in the Oval Office with Gianni Infantino, with Juventus during the Club World Cup, is there taking questions at length on any subjects, which has often put football people in slightly uncomfortable situations throughout the year, whether it's Juventus players standing there suddenly facing a question about transgender eligibility, whether it's questions about attacks on Iran. I think that was also why Juve were there during the Club World Cup. Gianni Infantino getting questions about crime in Democrat-run cities, whether World Cup matches will be taken off of them, and him being put in quite a difficult situation. You can't be publicly disagreeing with him there, the US president. But certainly one of the themes of the year has been the Oval Office. And of course, with the presence of the Club World Cup and the main World Cup, now the FIFA Peace Prize as well.
Perhaps the only place in the world that will have 3 gold FIFA trophies in it. One place apart, maybe the museum, the FIFA museum in Zurich. But yeah, the Oval Office is where all this is done, and where kind of a lot of news is made related to US foreign policy and the FIFA World Cup 2026. It's very, very strange times we're living in.
It is indeed some great trophies there. Obviously, Club World Cup trophy, signed twice, inscribed twice with Gianni Infantino's signature World Cup replica. And of course, the FIFA Peace Prize trophy, which it sounds like White House aides asked to ensure was at least as tall as the World Cup trophy, which is interesting. I've also asked FIFA, not had a reply, is does he get to keep that trophy or does he have to return it? And also, is it true that it's actually made of pure gold, as has been reported? No reply to those.
Players, coaches get to keep their FIFA Best trophy, I'd assume. So not unusual if you did get to keep the prize, but you don't get to keep the actual World Cup.
No, you don't get to keep the World Cup. And if it is made of solid gold, that is a very expensive trophy.
But ultimately, has this relationship between Infantino and Trump been a success throughout the year? Has the World Cup ever been criticised by Donald Trump? Has Gianni Infantino and FIFA ever been mocked, as even some of Trump's allies might be at times by the president? Has it actually been a successful alliance in terms of delivering this World Cup next year from FIFA's perspectives? Maybe not all the fans, because we've got at least 4 of the countries taking part in the World Cup having their fans on the travel ban list.
Well, you've just mentioned earlier in this pod these attacks on democratically run cities that are hosting the World Cup. Why don't you ask them? Has this been successful in terms of hosting the World Cup and how they feel about that?
I did.
And in terms
during the draw event when I asked a representative from Seattle, is your city a crap hole? And they were on the defence. I said, well, that's what the president says it is. Should you be losing World Cup matches? Seemed very accomplished, and that was actually at a FIFA event we asked. But they're able to defend their city.
Yeah, so just on this, though, when you asked a question, is it a successful alliance? Depends who for, isn't it? For Gianni Infantino, yes. He gets to travel all around the world with someone who is arguably the most powerful man in the world. So on a personal level, going back to that UEFA statement, yes, for him, for his private personal ends, yeah, he's in the entourage. Bigger vision of football, depends who you ask.
When you've got somebody as unpredictable and as Donald Trump being the president of the main host nation for the World Cup, then perhaps you think you want to get him on side and keep him on side to try and influence what he might do. But so I guess that's the sort of justification. But obviously, it's how far do you go? Because there is we've had complaints about whether he's actually breaching FIFA's political neutrality rules. Certainly some pressure groups are alleging as much.
A contrast is we never saw Donald Trump associated with Grand Slam track, that big athletics event launched in 2025 with the backing of Michael Johnson as the year ended, going into bankruptcy. If Donald Trump had been there, might have given it a bit more coverage, barely any attention at all around the world.
Maybe, but he's very smart in terms of communication. One of the smartest people out there for comms, I think, Donald Trump. He knows. Yeah, exactly. He knows the World Cup's a big deal. It's not the Grand Slam track for all the ambition that thing might have had. There is nothing bigger in sport than the Men's World Cup. It's coming to his country, as well as Canada and Mexico, but it's ostensibly in his country. The biggest platform you can ever have. And here's a man who loves big platforms. I don't think he was ever going to sully this in a way that introduce it or to ruin it. I think he knows how big this is, and he's riding with it. So it makes me think, I don't know how much Gianni really needs to be bending over backwards to the extent he does. Yes, have good relationships. Manufacture a peace prize? Maybe not.
It was an incredibly bizarre spectacle when being out in Washington for that World Cup draw. And you think over the years, it suddenly adds to this list of events that we've been to, whether it was the World Cup events before 2018 with Vladimir Putin, then the Emir in Qatar as well. And we've had this run of men's World Cups being surrounded by all these political leaders and the FIFA world.
Yeah, certainly, the response from people, to sort of friends and acquaintances who don't follow sort of sport or football that closely. That the thing they've all mentioned to me is the incredible World Cup draw with the everything around it. The FIFA Peace Prize, the YMCA, the whole sort of crazy hour and a half of entertainment and etc. before you actually get to the draw itself.
Got it talked about. What about the Club World Cup? So much riding on this. Would it be a success? Empty stadiums, the theme of the early part of the tournaments, the final then being about Donald Trump, the trophy presentation to Chelsea, him being part of that, again, putting more eyeballs on the Club World Cup. It was an event that for years, the questions, would it even happen? Delayed by the pandemic, eventually launched despite protests from some of the major leagues like the Premier League and the players' unions, including FIFA Pro, obviously on a global level. But ultimately, FIFA in 2025 got their Men's Club World Cup off the ground, got it in the calendar, went off without anything largely going wrong, learning a bit about the World Cup in terms of weather and climatic issues and delays. Although, as we saw recently with one report by an insurers, questions over whether it has led to an increase in the number of injuries in the subsequent months for the players who were part of it.
Rob, you said they got it off. Yes, they did, but let's not forget how they succeeded in doing that. This required a very curious arrangement with DAZN and Saudi Arabia stepping in with $1 billion check to buy these TV rights at way inflated market prices if you talk to people who were considering these rights. So FIFA required this extra funding from this TV group linked to the 2034 World Cup, which is one of the things we discussed earlier in the year that went to Saudi Arabia. So again, drew attention to governance at FIFA. Yes, it happened. And the climatic conditions, they were really, really, really hot. We did see some games where players were wilting. Now, FIFA may have learned some lessons here for the World Cup proper in next summer, where these games in those conditions will hopefully come under climate-controlled stadium roofs. But yes, it was successful in that it happened. People watched it, and there was a final. So yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think that is good points made about the how the strange funding arrangements. But so FIFA had to offer a lot of money to the club. So, for example, Chelsea, the winners, will have earned more than twice what the winners of the National Team World Cup will earn in 2026, because they had to offer this to try and basically tempt clubs to take it seriously and want to take part in it. Just the financial rewards had to be similar to the Champions League, effectively. And they would have obviously been seriously loss making if they hadn't had this Saudi money coming into DAZN, who allowed them to pay for the rights. I mean, I think it's here to stay, the Club World Cup. It'd be interesting to see how the funding goes forward in the future, because I still don't think it's going to make nearly the sort of money that is needed to pay the clubs at that level for some time, and certainly not the next one. Because, I mean, I know it was great for Chelsea and their fans to have won it, but it doesn't sort of resonate, I don't think, with the fan in the street as thinking this was a huge trophy. It's not like the Champions League still has much more prestige, it has to be said, and probably winning the Premier League in England probably has more prestige.
It is a big trophy, though, physically, the interlinking planetary orbits and this combination of discs.
And a golden key.
Yes, the key that opens up the trophy. And one of the questions is obviously about funding going forward, and for the women's edition, which will launch fully in 2028 in January. Who's going to show the competitions? Now we have this relationship between DAZN and FIFA, particularly for the FIFA Plus platform. We've never had any precise viewing figures from the Club World Cup in the summer. Some big headline numbers about the billions who watched overall and those who engaged with the clips. But we didn't get individual match breakdowns, as we don't tend to get from streamers as we would do with linear television. What FIFA says about the Club World Cup is it's about distributing more cash around the world, trying maybe to make football a bit less dominated and centred around Europe. Well, in Europe, it's often about the Premier League supremacy, particularly on global television rights and eyeballs around the world. And one of the things we saw again through the year was a push to take on the Premier League, finding different ways, and that meant for the Spanish and Italian leagues trying to take their domestic matches overseas. La Liga trying to do exactly what they did about 6-7 years ago with taking a game to the United States. This time Italy trying to take a Serie A game to Australia. So first, though, we had La Liga abandoning that Barcelona-Villarreal match in Miami, due to be in December. And then as the year came to a close, Serie A having to scrap plans to play Milan's match against Como in February in Perth in Australia.
First experiment in these overseas games, and that means that we're going to get, hopefully, the promised new protocols for this. FIFA and the other governing bodies under discussion to create a framework where these overseas games can take place. Of course, this happened after they settled a lawsuit in the United States.
Those big fan protests impacting La Liga, and the reason those cited for abandoning the Serie A game in Perth was what they were calling unacceptable requests from the Asian Football Confederation. It seemed they stood their ground, though, as well, and if you're going to put a match on their territory, everyone's going to have to pay for it.
Yeah. And I wonder what those demands were, and under what regulations does it require the Asian Confederation to agree? And this is one of the big questions around these overseas games, because the game involving Barcelona that has already been called off also faced some of this, not unreasonable demands, but did require CONCACAF to sign off, and it hadn't at the time it was abandoned.
And where you can get that groundswell of fan anger against taking matches overseas, as La Liga and Serie A tried to do, these competitions are stymied in their ambitions, and we saw it with FIFA as well. Pressure put on them over ticket prices for next year's World Cup, forcing them to introduce these $60 tickets across all 104 matches, although there still could only be a few hundred of them at each of the matches.
Yeah, 1.6% of the stadium bowls. Yeah, this was fan pressure, and also, I guess, being compelled to be seen to do the right thing out of humiliation, because the media coverage was horrific on this story.
There is one league that managed to take its games overseas. The Libyan League finishing its season in Italy in the summer. Tariq, maybe not just one of the most unusual trips of the year, but also some of the most unusual matches you must have been to.
Yeah, one of my more... It's been a funny year in general for me, but this definitely was not something that was on my bingo card in January 2025. I actually stumbled into this story. I was in Tripoli in Libya for some non-sports related work this year, and bumped into the Etihad football team of Tripoli. There are many Etihads in the Middle East, it seems like, football teams. And they were staying in my hotel. I asked what they were doing there. I said, well, they're preparing to go to Italy to finish the Libyan League Championship. Getting into those details, the country unfortunately remains divided in two, with a government in the east and another one based out of Tripoli. And the security situation means that teams from these parts of Libya cannot play their matches in the country. So ended up with a mini tournament in Italy with the top teams from each side playing round and robin games, playing a table, actually, playing a league. And the top teams from the two sides being put in two mini leagues, and a final eventually kicking off that would determine the winner. I went to the Tripoli derby in Milan, not at the San Siro, but at a very small stadium, expecting very little to happen, because this was a game without spectators, or so they said. But I was met with a phalanx of police in riot gear on a quiet Sunday, and they were quite right to be there. It absolutely descended into utter chaos. The second half was suspended for 27 minutes as both benches cleared out and the teams fought with each other. I think the goalkeeper of one of the teams was threatened with arrest before eventually calming down. That game would finish. It might be the latest completion to a football match in professional football this season, and it was quite a sight. No wonder it couldn't be held in Libya. But yeah, a crazy event to feature. I do hope things calm down in Libya and they get their league championship back.
Fascinating, Tariq. The places you get to, eh?
The games we watch.
Is that one of those ones when you're thinking, there must be a lot of other media here. How come I'm one of the few here to see this?
Well, I thought there would be. There really wasn't. There was media from Libya, like a TV stream, and it was very incongruent with what was happening in Libya and what I was seeing. So I'm in a relatively empty state. Some fans tried to break in. They'd come from not only Italy but other parts of Europe, even Tripoli. People had flown in from Libya to try and get into this game, but they were not allowed in. So that led to a bit of a fracas outside. But millions of people in Libya were tuning into this game, played in this empty stadium. It was a very strange experience.
It's one of those things that it's not going to get the attention of a transfer story, but the type of thing that's important to be at and interesting to be at through the year that helps to tell a wider story often beyond football, particularly when it's undercovered.
Yeah, super interesting. And football often delivers this opportunity to talk about these wider issues, doesn't it? And get to an audience that wouldn't normally be looking to read about these things.
And it was football and indeed cricket that helped to put more attention on Afghanistan this year and the suppression of women's rights there under the Taliban since they returned to power in 2021. Start of the year, reported a lot on the protests towards the International Cricket Council over why they're allowing the men's team to take part in the Champions Trophy, despite the fact there was no women's programme, and whether that was a breach of the rules. But then in the summer, into the autumn, went to see the Afghan women's football team, which had been brought back by FIFA. And they started to play some matches again under the Afghanistan United banner, and they played the games in Morocco. So in some way, football has managed to put the pressure on in a way that cricket hasn't, by saying, right, we're just going to get the team going. And it's something Gianni Infantino and FIFA have done, taking on a challenging situation.
It is interesting, though, whether should international sports federations allow men's teams to compete if the National Association doesn't allow women's teams to compete officially?
In March, Tariq and myself were in Greece for the International Olympic Committee elections, and probably not a surprise in the end, Kirsty Coventry being elected first female president of the IOC, and quite an impact through the year.
Yeah, that trip, I must say, was the scariest driving conditions I've had. I'm a terrible driver, and driving up there near Olympia with those windy roads, very glad to have made it back. Yeah, it felt like a really big deal, but the IOC, unlike, I don't know, it felt relatively low key. I don't know if what it felt like for you, but this is a big moment. But the IOC members, we had Sheikh Tamim from Qatar, you had the Ambani family, you had all of this kind of, I guess, the plutocracy in place, and all their bodyguards is the other thing I remember. But the actual event itself, when comparing to all the stuff we've discussed earlier about FIFA, felt relatively low-key and old-fashioned.
Maybe because it was business-like, nothing dramatic, nothing very political, more caution.
Yeah, I think it's probably that is very much IOC sort of does maintain its sort of traditions a bit like that, doesn't it? You're right. It's more sort of kind of respectful, I guess. But I mean, one of the things that people said is that Kirsty Coventry was Thomas Bach's chosen successor, and perhaps there was concerns she would just be a sort of carrying out his bidding. Actually, she's shown herself very much not to be that, I think, so far. Some of the things she's said, her approaches on sort of transgender rules, and just looking at some of the things that Thomas Bach brought in. For example, I mean, this hasn't been confirmed yet, but I mean, from what I understand, this huge spending that goes on the Olympic channel is something which she and her new administration is going to look at quite seriously.
Yeah, that big thing launched in 2016. They thought they could get this linear Olympic channel around the world. It would take off. It's been scaled back, largely to be digital in many ways. What happens to that going forward? We've never seen, since her election in March, Kirsty Coventry meeting Donald Trump.
Yeah, and it's a big one because, of course, they've got the Olympics in Los Angeles in 2028, and she hasn't tried to do any of these things Gianni Infantino has been seen to be doing. I think she's had a very decent start to her presidency, especially given what Martyn mentioned earlier, which was the this idea that she's this anointed successor of Thomas Bach and he'll be remote controlling from behind. She seems to have her own vision and is deliberately going through it. Nothing flashy. It's been a good start, hasn't it?
Yeah, and the other quite significant change, I think, is restoring the kind of involvement of the IOC members in choosing the Olympic hosts, because under Thomas Bach, that had effectively become an executive decision by him and his chief. So they, just having one candidate going forward. For example, Brisbane for 2032. She's now looking at making this much more of a sort of bidding contest as old, involving the votes by the IOC members, although obviously that comes with its own problems.
I was going to say it carries certain risks, doesn't it? You look back at the bid for Tokyo, bid for Rio, both under criminal investigation. So she is taking a risk there.
Good news for the consultants and all the PRs and comms people who benefit from contested bids.
Yeah, absolutely. We're back in the game. It'll be interesting to see this and what processes they're in. The way Brisbane was handed the Olympics, which was obviously backed by the IOC vice president at the time, John Coates, is a big story for another day, probably.
Pause and reflect. That's been the mantra of Kirsty Coventry. It could have been quite challenging in terms of public spats with someone like Donald Trump, particularly over transgender eligibility, because he started his second presidency with this executive order banning transgender women from women's sport, threatening to deny visas to trans women who are trying to go to the Olympics to compete in women's sport. But very gently, quite quietly, the IOC has got on with its new policy, reflecting the direction of travel around the world, which is about sporting fairness and safety. And as those new rules are put in place and whether they end up with sex verification testing, because that's something we saw this year by World Athletics for its World Championships with these swab tests.
Yeah, those tests just basically test for male chromosomes, so they're sort of non-invasive, really. Yes, I mean, I think the IOC doing it the right way. You know, did it properly, having a comprehensive scientific and medical review involving not only its own medical director leading the process, but also external consultants. I think that is the right thing to do and a proper way to go about it. So you're not just doing something off the back of a sort of social media storm. So yeah, that has been good.
Sex verification testing, something that we've talked a lot about through the year and surely into next year as well. So we've talked a lot about, is FIFA becoming too political? But they can't escape political decisions or involvement. We had Gianni Infantino went to the Donald Trump Mideast Peace Summit at Sharm el-Sheikh. Then FIFA announcing this fund for Gaza, pledges to help rebuild following the war. And as the year draws to an end, there is the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. But at the same time, we are still seeing fighting. We are still seeing deaths there, which means that we are still seeing these questions culturally about Israel's participation events. So in Eurovision, in the song contest, more widely, but in our world, still about whether FIFA should still have teams in international football.
Yeah, I mean, as we both reported at the time, Rob, UEFA came very close to taking a vote on whether Israel should be excluded from its competitions. Probably would have gone ahead with it, I think, had it not been for the ceasefire, which then sort of made it fairly obvious that perhaps would be a step too far. But I think they were on the brink of it. You know, we had Benjamin Netanyahu making calls to try and stop that happening. And then there's obviously been, since then, there's been lots of furore around whether fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv in the Europa League should play at Aston Villa, and then there have been protests at other countries. And I think you went both to Aston Villa, and then you went to Germany as well to cover their match there, Rob.
Yes, when Maccabi Tel Aviv played Stuttgart, and it took a huge police operation, several thousand officers. I spent time during the day in effectively a fan zone set aside outside near the train station, and largely good-natured. Did, though, see some fans coming up to us in English, actually, being abusive towards Palestinians. And then in the stadium, we had anti-Arab chants as well from a pocket of those fans. It led to the club having a fine imposed by UEFA, also a ban on selling away tickets to them for a match, but that's suspended for 2 years. And at the same time, we are still seeing questions in England that will linger into the new year of West Midlands Police and how they took that decision to ban Maccabi Tel Aviv fans from Aston Villa. And in some ways, there are two things running in parallel. One is the actual decision-making. Was it proportionate to ban the Maccabi fans compared with other matches? So they didn't ban the Swiss club Young Boys having fans at their later match in the Europa League phase, despite having several UEFA punishments for fan disorder against them in recent years. Then it actually led to police officers being attacked inside Villa Park and at least one fan immediately being jailed from Young Boys. But then separate to that, because many people can discuss the conduct and debate it and whether or not you should ban fans at all. And the position of football supporters Europe is very much usually largely against blanket bans. But then it's how West Midlands Police formed the intelligence that led to the ban, because within it seems they used AI, because in the document it had a match that Maccabi Tel Aviv played against West Ham in 2023 that just didn't exist when it talked about their last visit to England.
Who would have thought AI could ever get anything wrong? No, it's
hallucinating AI.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely fascinating.
So where does it go into next year? There's a UEFA Congress in February. The Football Association of Ireland have been mandated by their members to bring up the issue of whether Israel should be banned.
Yeah, I think it will definitely be discussed. I think a lot depends on what happens actually within Israel and Gaza now, actually. If things sort of go in this sort of low-level sporadic violence we see now, then probably I can't see UEFA bringing anything drastic. But if there is a sort of a new development, serious, significant development in Gaza, then perhaps that could happen. But I think it needs something really significant for that to change.
And separate to Gaza, at the heart of Palestinian complaints about Israel's presence in international football is the existence of teams in West Bank settlements playing in Israeli competitions, something that FIFA's been looking at for some years now without a conclusion.
All eyes on the UEFA Congress. And actually, talking of UEFA Congresses, the previous one in Belgrade, that's where Gianni Infantino announced in his speech, sort of stealing the limelight somewhat, that the kind of also shadowing the award of the two men's World Cups in 2030 and 2034, FIFA doing the same thing for 2031 and 2035. No votes, effectively, single candidates, USA for 2031 and the UK for 2035. So yes, questions around there, I guess. This is the same sort of thing as slightly around Saudi Arabia, about these deals being done without sort of wider scrutiny.
Although some in FIFA think there's been maybe less scrutiny because the UK are the beneficiaries of getting the World Cup in 2035, saying, well, it's the same thing you call a fast-track process that was favourable towards Saudi Arabia, and yet it's the World Cup going to the UK, to England for the first time since '66 in the men's. So fewer questions being asked. It's just moved on to the tournament build-up itself.
Oh, well, maybe FIFA's hoping that the UK Sovereign Wealth Fund will pay $1 billion for the next Club World Cup rights.
And certainly Gianni Infantino did create some news at that UEFA Congress, because you might have left Belgrade without much of a headline.
That's true. And from UEFA's Congress to its competition in Switzerland, the Women's Euros. Were you there the whole tournament, Rob?
Well, the time of the year when we spend on some real football. And I was there from the start to the end, although tragically just before the opening match for England had been there for the opening match of the tournament. That's when Diogo Jota died in the car crash in northern Spain with his brother Andre Silva, and I ended up going to Gondomar, the hometown of Jota, spending days speaking to those who knew him, going to the funeral, the sight you can never imagine, just weeks after Jota was winning the Premier League, with Liverpool winning the Nations League, with Portugal there, with his teammates carrying his coffin into his funeral.
Yeah, very, very sad, wasn't it? And I suppose it's just a reminder. Sometimes dealing with sport, although we deal with the more serious side of sports, sometimes you end up dealing with the very, very serious and very sad moments too.
Although then I did return to Switzerland, was there right to the end covering England, their unexpected journey. So many times they thought they might be eliminated. In the end, they managed to pull it off and win the trophy, delivering back-to-back Euros titles, and probably the best outcome for UEFA, because England has been integral to the growth of women's football, the promotion of it, and in terms of the sort of wider coverage. And largely, the tournament a success for UEFA. And with it being in Switzerland, it was expensive. Not huge stadiums, so it meant we were never really talking about empty seats, because they were sort of 20, 30,000 stadiums that looked full. And there was a big atmosphere around, visiting fans there. So largely they pulled it off. A more ambitious tournament planned for next time in Germany, using far bigger stadiums, which will put greater sort of pressure on the organisers to deliver those big crowds, because if you think back to 2022, when England hosted it, it was the first game at Old Trafford, the final at Wembley that had the huge stadiums. The plan in Germany is to be using those big ones throughout. So probably they really have to ratchet up the planning in a way we've not really seen from Brazil for the next Women's World Cup. That's in 2027, so a year and a half away, yet we barely hear a word out of them, and they've got a lot of work to do in terms of bringing the crowds in.
Yeah, they certainly have in Brazil. Germany is actually sort of quite a developed women's football market in terms of Europe, so that's probably less of a challenge. But even so, it's good that they've got those ambitious targets. And yeah, the women's Euros wins. I mean, it's definitely, you can see if when you have that victory in the country that's achieved that success, it has a rebound on the club game for sure.
The contrast in this year is the Women's Rugby Union World Cup, staged in England, won by England, but rugby union struggling for attention since then. Not just the women's game, the men's game as well. This was a year of a potential breakaway being launched in the men's game, R360, and much like the Football Super League in 2021, collapsed, but without fan protest. This was rugby from within and not following the playbook of where things went wrong with the Football Super League, not building up the case publicly, allowing the critics to really come to the fore and to drown out any maybe positive moves from R360, but a breakaway crushed quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the national federations basically said that any players playing for this breakaway would be banned from their national teams, which is a big issue. You're right. I'm not sure rugby has that financial weight at the moment for these breakaway leagues to be successful. So a bit of a risk, a bit like the Grand Slam track and athletics. It's these bright ideas sound great on paper. In practice, they can end in disaster.
And that brings us to the person we haven't mentioned at all this year, but is the person who's the big beneficiary of the Super League collapse in football in 2021, yet is only seen as power rise throughout the year. Nasser Al-Khelaifi was the head of the European Club Association, rebranded European football clubs, part of now the UEFA setup in terms of selling the rights to the Champions League, television rights and commercial rights. We've not mentioned him through the year, but he's someone who gave press conferences, that's one thing, but also increasingly influential behind the scenes. The PSG boss.
Yeah. So, yeah, PSG obviously achieved their ambition, didn't they, winning the Champions League, which I think was something the Qatar Sport Investments have been aiming for since they took over back in, whenever it was, 2011, 2012. Yeah, Nasser Al-Khelaifi, European football clubs, very, very powerful now. This sort of joint enterprise with the UEFA, it's not just the Champions League rights they're talking about. They're heavily involved in the Club World Cup deal. So they're calling the shots a lot of the time. And the money that is going to be coming in, the extra cash from the new Champions League deals, TV deals, negotiated by Relevant Sports and with new kids on the block, Paramount coming in to take a big chunk of the rights, including in the UK. I think, yeah, Nasser Al-Khelaifi and European football clubs, their power is only going to get stronger.
Well, what a year it's been, and great to discuss it on here throughout the year, and Happy New Year to all our listeners as well.
Happy New Year.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye.